you ever questioned whether the death penalty should be abolished? Some see it as the ultimate form of justice, the only fitting punishment for the most heinous crimes. Others view it as a cruel, outdated practice that has no place in a modern society. But no matter where you stand, one thing is undeniable: the death penalty isn't the same everywhere. In the US, a death row inmate waits an average of 22 years before execution, long enough to start a family, raise kids into adulthood, and watch them grow into adulthood. But what if you were in China? You'd have just 50 days, barely enough time to write a memoir, let alone find a publisher. And Belarus? Now, that's a real shocker. Here, death row inmates have exactly 2 minutes to accept their fate before being executed by gunfire. No time to write a will, no chance to say goodbye, and no clue what's even happening. But the differences don't stop at execution timelines. The crimes that warrant the death penalty, the methods of execution, and the conditions on death row vary drastically from country to country. And did you know that in some places, simply saying the wrong thing can get you sentenced to death? Let's explore some chilling, bizarre, and eye-opening facts about death row worldwide, where every extra day alive is just another day waiting for the inevitable. Where is the death penalty still used? The death penalty has always been a hotly debated topic. Some nations see it as a necessary deterrent to crime, while others believe it's a barbaric relic of the past. But regardless of opinion, one thing is certain: not all death penalties are created equal. As of 2025, 112 countries have completely abolished capital punishment, according to the latest report from Amnesty International. One of the most recent examples is Zimbabwe, which officially abolished the death penalty on December 31, 2024, after President Emerson Mnangagwa signed it into law, a major step forward in the global movement against capital punishment. If you're wondering where execution is no longer a risk for criminals, you might want to stick to Europe, Canada, or Australia. But don't get too excited. Life in prison really means life in prison in these places. There's no parole for good behavior, no second chances. You won't be executed, but you'll never walk free again. Then there are the 28 countries where the death penalty still exists on paper but hasn't been enforced in over a decade. One prime example? South Korea. Dozens of prisoners remain on death row, but their fate is in limbo, sentenced to death but seemingly forgotten. South Korea is famous for K-pop and K-dramas. But few people realize that capital punishment is technically still in place. At this rate, some of these inmates might still be waiting after BTS enlists and completes their military service. But not every country is just postponing executions, some are actively reforming their approach. Take Malaysia, for example. On April 3, 2023, Malaysia abolished mandatory death sentences, reduced the number of crimes punishable by execution, and eliminated life imprisonment without parole, a groundbreaking shift in the nation's justice system. Meanwhile, 55 countries still actively use the death penalty. You can probably guess some of the usual suspects: the US, China, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea. But the biggest surprise? Japan is still on the list. And not only does Japan still have the death penalty, but it also enforces one of the most psychologically torturous execution systems in the world. In Japan, death row inmates are never told their execution date. They wake up each morning not knowing if it will be their last. If you've ever had a boss call you in for a meeting without warning, imagine that, except instead of a meeting, you might be walked straight to the gallows. But what kind of crimes actually warrant the death penalty? Is it just murder? Or are there offenses so extreme that even hearing about them will send chills down your spine? The answer might shock you. What crimes can get you executed? Think the death penalty is only for murderers? Think again. Depending on the country, the list of capital offenses can be as long as a restaurant menu. And some of the crimes on it are downright shocking. In the US, capital punishment isn't just for murder. You could face the death penalty for espionage, treason, or certain drug-related crimes. So if you've ever dreamed of being a double agent like James Bond, just don't do it in the US, because you might never leave the interrogation room alive. In Japan, it's not as simple as kill someone, get executed. The courts use a strict evaluation system called the Nagayama criteria, which considers factors like the level of brutality, number of victims, motive, and the reaction of the victim's family before deciding on a death sentence. So, if a crime isn't deemed cruel enough, or if the victim's family isn't pushing for execution, the offender might avoid death row. Then there's North Korea, where the list of capital crimes is, let's just say, unique. Murder? Of course. Drug trafficking? Sure. But forging documents or serious disrespect? That too. What exactly qualifies as serious disrespect? No one knows. And no one dares ask, because asking the wrong person might just make you the next example. Meanwhile, in Nigeria and Saudi Arabia, you can be sentenced to death for adultery, homosexuality, or blasphemy. Some places use stoning, while others beheading. Either way, these aren't places where you want to test the limits of free speech or explore your true love in the wrong way. Clearly, the line between life and death is thinner than you think. In some countries, drug use might get you a fine, while in others, it could get you executed. This raises a big question. Is the death penalty truly justice? Or just a reflection of each country's extreme laws? But hold on, what happens after someone is sentenced to death? A lethal injection? A firing squad? Or something even more terrifying? Brace yourself, because the next section will make you rethink the very concept of execution. Execution methods, terrifyingly diverse. If you think all death row inmates around the world face the same execution methods, think again. Every country has its own way of sending off prisoners. Some claim to be humane, while others are downright nightmarish. In the US, lethal injection remains the most common method. But some states are bringing back older execution techniques. South Carolina reinstated the firing squad in 2021 after a 15-year hiatus, while Louisiana recently approved nitrogen gas as a new execution method, sparking intense controversy. If lethal injection is considered the more humane approach, then the electric chair looks like something straight out of an 80s horror film. And the gas chamber? Only 3 US states still allow it. But if you've ever studied what happened in World War II, you'll understand why this is far from a peaceful way to go. In Japan and Singapore, hanging is still the preferred method. A simple but disturbingly efficient process. If you think hanging is just about tying a rope and kicking a stool, you're mistaken. In Japan, the floor beneath the prisoner suddenly collapses, causing the body to freefall. The force instantly snaps the neck. But if the calculations are off, the prisoner can be left gasping for air for minutes before finally succumbing. A method so straightforward, yet so haunting. In China, North Korea, and Indonesia, execution by firing squad is the go-to method. In China, the prisoner is typically shot in the back of the head, while in North Korea, they may face a firing squad of multiple soldiers. But the most terrifying report? Some sources claim that North Korea has used anti-aircraft guns to execute prisoners. Yes, weapons designed to take down airplanes. Just imagine the sheer horror of that scene. In Vietnam, executions were once carried out by firing squad. But since 2013, the country has transitioned to lethal injection. While this is supposed to be a softer alternative, not all injections go smoothly. There have been cases where the drugs failed to work properly, leading to prolonged and excruciating pain before death. In Saudi Arabia, executions look like something straight out of medieval history books, public beheadings with a sword. These executions often take place in public squares, with hundreds of onlookers. If the executioner is highly skilled, the head falls immediately. But what happens if they miscalculate the strike? The prisoner may suffer a far more agonizing death than necessary. And then there's Belarus, where there's no delay. No time to panic. Once sentenced, a prisoner has exactly 2 minutes before being shot in the head. No extended appeals. No last words, just a quick, brutal end before they even realize what's happening. Each country has its own definition of justice. But if you're wondering which method is the most humane, the truth is, none of them really are. But if you think execution itself is the worst part of a death sentence, think again. For many inmates, waiting for death is even worse than death itself. Life on death row, waiting is worse than dying. If you think the worst part of a death sentence is the execution, you clearly haven't experienced death row. Here, inmates aren't just waiting for death, they're forced to endure years, sometimes decades, of extreme isolation, mental torture, and the constant fear that today might be their last. In the US, death row inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, only allowed 1 hour of exercise, and even that takes place in a tiny, fenced-in enclosure. There's no air conditioning, no comfort. In Alabama, summer temperatures can soar above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or 32 degrees Celsius, and many prisoners have nothing but a small desk fan to keep cool. Some inmates stand inside toilets just to get relief from the heat, as it's the only place with running water. In Japan, death row prisoners live in tiny 80-square-foot cells, sleeping on thin mats on the floor, eating strictly regulated meals, and having zero contact with other inmates. But the most terrifying part? They are never told when their execution will happen. Every morning, they wake up not knowing if today will be the day. Some inmates endure this psychological torture for decades, and many go insane before they are finally executed. In Vietnam, many death row prisoners are shackled by their ankles 24/7, only allowed 15 minutes of movement per day for basic hygiene and meals. If considered high risk, they may be under constant surveillance, stripped of all privacy. In India, prisoners face brutal living conditions, but what's even more terrifying? Some death row cells directly face the execution area. That means inmates are forced to watch as others are led to their deaths, knowing that one day, it will be their turn. If Japan's system is mental torture from uncertainty, then India's is pure psychological torment through anticipation. There's no rehabilitation, no hope on death row, just an endless wait for the inevitable. Some inmates wait for decades, clinging to desperate appeals that are often denied. So if you had to choose, would you rather die immediately or spend years in complete isolation, waiting for the moment they come for you? But before prisoners are led to their fate, there's one last privilege that many still get, their final meal. If you had just one meal left before you died, what would you choose? If you had one last meal before facing execution, what would you choose? A lavish feast? A dish that reminds you of childhood? Or something deeply symbolic? In the United States, most death row inmates are allowed to request a final meal. But this privilege is not entirely unrestricted. Some states impose spending limits, while others have completely banned the practice following cases where inmates use their requests to mock the system. Florida caps the final meal budget at $40. Not enough for luxury dining but sufficient for a decent meal. Oklahoma limits it even further to $15, barely enough for a fast food combo. The message is clear: eat whatever you want, as long as it's cheap. Texas, however, eliminated final meal requests altogether in 2011. The reason? An inmate named Lawrence Brewer ordered an extravagant meal: 2 steaks, 3 fajitas, a bacon cheeseburger, 3 milkshakes, a whole pizza, and more, only to refuse to eat a single bite. His actions angered state officials to the point that they abolished the privilege for all future death row inmates. Not everyone, however, opts for a grand feast before their execution. Some requests are so unusual that they seem to hold hidden messages. John Wayne Gacy, the infamous serial killer, chose a full KFC meal. Before his arrest, Gacy managed a chain of KFC restaurants, making his choice appear as a twisted nod to his past life. Victor Fker, executed in 1963, requested a single olive with the pit still inside. He believed that the pit would grow into an olive tree on his grave, symbolizing peace. Unfortunately, no tree ever grew, but his eerie final request remains one of the most memorable. Ajmal Kasub, the sole surviving terrorist from the 2008 Mumbai attacks, was given a basket of tomatoes before his execution in 2012. He ate only one. No one knows why. Perhaps he wanted to leave behind an unsolved mystery. Outside the United States, different countries have their own traditions regarding final meals. In Japan, prisoners do not get to choose. They eat the standard prison meal. But there's a chilling detail: if they are given a cigarette afterward, it often signals that their execution is imminent. In Indonesia, some inmates are allowed to share their last meal with family, creating a deeply emotional moment between life and death. Before abolishing the death penalty, the Philippines allowed inmates to drink a bottle of liquor before execution. Was it meant to calm their nerves or ensure they wouldn't resist? No one knows for sure. If it were you, what would be your last meal? But not every condemned prisoner actually faces execution. Some receive last-minute pardons or find legal loopholes to escape death. How does this happen? Let's explore the controversial world of pardons, legal exceptions, and last-minute reprieves in the next section. The death penalty is often seen as the harshest punishment. But not everyone sentenced to die actually meets their end. Some individuals are granted clemency, while others manage to escape execution due to legal technicalities or humanitarian concerns. Minors who committed crimes before turning 18 are generally exempt from execution in most countries, as legal systems recognize that young offenders can change. Pregnant women and mothers of young children may have their executions postponed or even commuted in some places. But in other countries, the sentence is carried out immediately after childbirth. Individuals with intellectual disabilities are often spared, provided they can prove they lacked full understanding of their crimes. However, the most controversial way to escape execution is by literally buying one's life back. In some countries, money can save a condemned prisoner from death. In the United Arab Emirates, a convict can be spared if the victim's family agrees to accept financial compensation. In other words, if you have enough money or can persuade the victim's relatives, you can escape execution. This may sound like an outdated medieval practice, but it still exists within modern legal systems. Iran follows a similar system called diyah, where a convicted person's family can negotiate a financial settlement with the victim's relatives to avoid execution. The amount can reach millions of dollars, effectively turning justice into a transaction. Pakistan has a comparable system, but corruption often skews the process, allowing the wealthy to buy their freedom while the poor are left with no options but to face their fate. This raises an ethical dilemma. If money can determine life or death, where does justice truly stand? The death penalty remains one of the most debated legal practices in the world. Some countries execute inmates immediately, while others keep them waiting for decades, living in constant fear. Some nations impose the death penalty for a long list of crimes, while others reserve it only for the most severe offenses. Some allow death row inmates to choose their final meal, while others do not even inform prisoners of their execution date. With countries like Malaysia and Zimbabwe moving towards abolishing capital punishment, global perspectives on the death penalty are shifting. Will the world eventually eliminate executions altogether? Or will some countries continue to uphold them as a necessary form of justice? So, what do you think? Does the death penalty truly serve justice? Or is it simply a cycle of punishment and fear? What's more terrifying, dying instantly or spending decades living with the uncertainty of execution? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this video insightful and full of shocking facts, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more gripping content in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.